We're looking at the state of resurrection research. So as we dive to look into some of the evidence that's out there and how scholars view the resurrection, I think it'll be helpful if we go back and look at how these arguments and how the perspective of resurrection research has changed over the past few decades. Now, it might be helpful if we look at two different examples, one, a more popular apologist, and then one, arguably the leading resurrection scholar in the world today, who's probably studied the resurrection as much or more than anybody alive. Well, to consider a popular apologist, I figured I would start with my father, Josh McDowell, because he has been studying the resurrection and the scriptures and the deity of Christ. Really, probably he's in his sixth decade or so studying this. And his story was he set out roughly in the 1950s as a college student to disprove Christianity and show that it was false. He was challenged by some friends who were believers, and he thought it was a joke. Well, as he traveled really around the world at this time, he had saved up enough money from a painting business. He started looking at manuscripts in Europe, went to the Middle East, met with scholars, professors, libraries, gathering the evidence to prove Christianity is false. Well, ended up concluding at this time that there's good evidence the scriptures are reliable, Jesus claimed to be God, and Jesus rose from the grave. Well, he first chronicled his positive case in the 1972 book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Well, recently I had a chance to partner with him and about 36 students from our apologetics program here at Biola and 12 leading scholars around the world to update this book. Well, one of the questions I asked my father, because he's been doing this for so long and has a different perspective than me, is how does the evidence compare now versus when you first set out to disprove Christianity? And the metaphor my father came up with is he said there is a tsunami of evidence for the Christian faith. Now, if you happen to know my dad, he's never understated anything in his life. He's just bigger than life and everything is exciting. So I understand the metaphor, but it really stuck with me. I thought, wow, that was enough to convince him as a skeptic trying to disprove it in the 50s. The evidence for manuscripts, the archaeological evidence, the testimonial evidence has grown just remarkably during that time, which is very encouraging for us studying the resurrection. So I thought, gosh, a tsunami of evidence. I'm going to write an article for him and, of course, have him approve it and put it in his words and submit it as an op-ed. And actually, interestingly enough, Fox News accepted it as an op-ed article. And he titled it, "The Evidence for Christianity is Like a Tsunami." Now, I mention this because it completely went viral. People were talking about it and sharing it. Skeptics were responding to it. Christians were talking about it. And it just hit me that we're told we live in a post-truth culture in which all about feelings and not about evidence. And there is some truth to that we are motivated to look at the world oftentimes through our feelings and told to discount truth. But the reality is people are hungry and they want evidence and they want truth. In fact, as you look at young people today, a high percentage, according to Barna's research, say they are open to evidence for the Christian faith. So there's a hunger in culture, and those like my father who have done this for a long time can attest that the evidence has only gotten stronger over the past few years. Now, let me contrast my father, who's more of an evangelist and a popular apologist, with Gary Habermas, PhD, of course. He did his PhD specifically in Michigan at a public university, studying the historical resurrection for Jesus in 1975. He has probably studied the resurrection and all of the issues surrounding it more than anybody alive today. So he has some authority to speak about how the evidence fares today versus how it did in the past. Now, there's an article, you can pull it up, that he wrote in 2017, and it was for the Christian Research Journal. It's called Changing Attitudes Toward the Resurrection of Jesus. And essentially what he writes is going back to when he did his dissertation in the 1970s. If somebody believed in the resurrection, they were either an evangelical or a Roman Catholic. Very few other people gave any credence to the idea that Jesus actually rose from the grave, or at least that there was good support in favor of it. Now, he said, it's completely changed. Scholarship has shifted. And it's not that everybody embraces the resurrection, but scholarship has shifted in a direction much more favorable in terms of historical evidence for the resurrection than it had in the past. Now, according to Habermas, as he lays out in this article, what's responsible for the shift? And he says, essentially, it's the preponderance of the evidence. It's really the evidence that has grown and the arguments that have been made and the number of scholars studying and researching this that has made the case stronger than it's ever been. And here's some of the shifts that he lists that are very, very interesting. He says critics have shifted to what he calls meta-critics, who question the overall resurrection message rather than focusing on individual aspects of the story of the resurrection itself. So it's more of a top-down critique rather than a bottom-up critique. So the two main critical approaches today would be that resurrections don't happen. Maybe there's some evidence in favor of Jesus living, dying, and people thinking he appeared to them, but we know that resurrections don't happen, which is really because of the influence of naturalism. And we're going to look at that coming up next week. Second, that the documents are biased and cannot be trusted as historical sources. So the kinds of objections have shifted to critiquing the Gospels as a whole not being reliable, maybe full of contradictions, and towards this naturalistic assumption, rather than these particular arguments in the past. So in the 19th century, there was a drove of skeptics and critics who came up with these alternative theories for the resurrection. Things like the women went to the wrong tomb, or the resurrection was a conspiracy, or the swoon theory, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. These kind of objections are now on a popular level, and we're going to talk about them in this class. We need to think through how to respond to them. But on an academic level, these are not the kind of arguments that are being made as they were in the past. The discussion and debate has shifted. And the last point he makes is that almost all scholars accept certain facts around the life of Jesus. And we're going to get into this. You'll read this in Lacona, and we're going to talk about this as we work through the class further. But there's certain minimal facts that virtually all scholars accept, such as that Jesus lived, Jesus died, that he was a miracle worker in some sense, and that his apostles had experiences that they believed to be of the risen Jesus. And also the conversion of, say, James, and the conversion of Saul, ultimately becoming Paul. Friends, we have nothing to be afraid of by challenges to the faith. From a popular apologist like my father, to a scholar working in the highest ranks of academia on the historical Jesus, we have only seen in recent decades that the case has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. Looking forward to seeing you next week as we start to move towards making this case itself.